3.6 million people. That's how many died in a single disaster that your government doesn't want you to know about. Not a war, not a natural catastrophe. A deliberate policy decision made by men in suits who knew exactly what would happen. And here's what should terrify you. The documents proving they knew have been declassified for decades, sitting in archives that almost nobody reads. While you were taught about certain tragedies in school, 5 of the deadliest man-made disasters in human history were systematically erased from your education. We're talking about events that killed more people than some wars, destroyed entire regions for generations, and were covered up so thoroughly that even mentioning them today makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you 5 disasters where the death tolls were deliberately hidden, where corporations and governments made calculated decisions that millions of lives were worth less than their profits, and where the people responsible not only escaped justice but were promoted, celebrated, and allowed to do it again. By the end of this, you'll understand why they don't teach this in schools. You'll know why certain numbers are still classified. And you'll recognize the exact same patterns happening right now in your country as you watch this. But before I reveal the disaster that killed 3.6 million people in just 2 years, you need to understand how something this massive gets hidden in plain sight. 1943. Bengal, India. The region was one of the most fertile agricultural areas in the world, known for producing multiple rice harvests annually. Approximately 60 million people lived there, most of them farmers who'd worked the same land for generations. Calcutta was a thriving city of over 2 million people. Markets overflowed with produce. Granaries held surplus rice from the previous harvest. Life was normal, ordinary, safe. Families planned weddings. Children attended school. Farmers planted their fields as they had for centuries. But something was happening that these 60 million people didn't know about. Ships were being redirected. Rice exports were increasing. Storage facilities were being emptied and not refilled. And in London, in a building thousands of miles away, men were looking at maps and making calculations. Calculations about how many people could die before it became politically problematic. Calculations about whether dead Indians were worth less than well-fed British soldiers. Specific warnings had been issued. In January of 1943, the Bengal provincial government sent urgent messages to the British administration. Local officials reported that rice prices were climbing dangerously. They warned that hoarding by merchants, combined with export policies, was creating artificial scarcity. They predicted famine if policies weren't changed immediately. These warnings included specific numbers, specific timelines, specific solutions. They were read, filed, and ignored. By March of 1943, the first deaths from starvation were being reported in rural areas. People were dying in their homes, too weak to seek help, while trains loaded with rice rolled past their villages heading to ports. At 9:30 in the morning on March 15, 1943, a farmer named Sunil Chatterjee walked to the market in his village to buy rice for his family. The price had doubled overnight. He couldn't afford it. He went home and told his wife they'd have to ration what they had, make it last. Hope prices came down. They didn't come down. They kept rising. 1 week later, Sunil went back to the market. The price had doubled again. He sold his plow, the tool he needed to farm, to buy rice. 1 month later, there was no rice at any price. The shops were empty. The granaries were empty. The rice had been exported to support the war effort. Sunil's youngest daughter died first. She was 3 years old. Severe malnutrition over 6 weeks had destroyed her immune system. A simple infection her body would normally fight off killed her in 3 days. Then his mother, already weak from age, died from starvation. Then his wife, who'd been giving most of her food to their surviving children. Sunil carried his wife's body to the road and left it there because he was too weak to bury her and there was nowhere to bury her anyway. The roadsides were lined with corpses, thousands of them, then tens of thousands, bodies that nobody had the strength to move. Dogs and vultures fed on the dead while the living watched. Sunil and his two surviving children started walking toward Calcutta. They'd heard there might be food in the city. There was. Calcutta's streets were filled with skeletal figures begging for food that didn't exist. People were eating grass, leaves, leather, anything. Sunil's son died on the streets of Calcutta. His daughter disappeared, probably sold or taken. Sunil never knew. He survived. He lived to watch 3 million to 3.6 million people die in the Bengal Famine of 1943. But the body count is just the beginning of this story. Because while millions starved, while children died in the streets, while mothers threw themselves in rivers because they couldn't watch their babies suffer anymore, the British administration was exporting rice. Not just continuing normal exports, increasing them. Ships loaded with Bengal rice sailed to Britain, to Ceylon, to stockpiles across the empire. The rice that could have saved millions was deliberately removed from Bengal and sent elsewhere. And the man ultimately responsible for this policy, the man who received the warnings and chose to continue the exports, the man who was informed of the death toll as it climbed and did nothing, was Winston Churchill. Yes, that Winston Churchill. The one celebrated as a hero of World War II. The one with statues and memorials across the Western world. He received regular updates on the famine. He knew the death toll, and he refused to redirect even a single shipload of grain to Bengal. When officials begged him to send food aid, he responded by asking why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. He blamed the Indians themselves, claiming they were breeding like rabbits. He argued that sending food to Bengal would be wasted because the Indians were inferior and would just continue to overpopulate. These weren't private thoughts. These were official policy positions, documented in government records that were classified for decades and are now available in the British National Archives. Stop and think about this for a second. 3.6 million people. That's more than the population of Chicago, more than the entire nation of Uruguay. Dead in 2 years, from a famine that was entirely preventable. That was, in fact, deliberately created through policy decisions. And the man responsible died celebrated as a hero, never faced any consequences, and is still honored today. Now here's what should terrify you. This wasn't unique. This wasn't one evil man making one terrible decision. This was standard operating procedure. Did you notice what all the elements of this disaster have in common? Warnings that were ignored. Decisions prioritizing profit and politics over human lives. A calculated determination that certain people's deaths were acceptable costs. A cover-up that lasted generations. That's not an anomaly. That's a pattern. And that pattern repeats across every disaster I'm about to show you. But what I'm about to reveal next is even worse. Because at least the Bengal famine eventually ended. The next disaster I'm going to describe is still killing people today, 70 years later, and the corporations responsible are still operating, still profitable, still protected by the same governments that let it happen. The immediate aftermath of the Bengal famine saw bodies cleared from the streets only because they became a disease hazard. Official death counts were systematically undercounted. The British administration recorded approximately 1.5 million deaths. They didn't count rural areas where entire villages died with no one left to report the deaths. They didn't count deaths from disease caused by malnutrition. They didn't count the babies who died in the womb as their mothers starved. Independent investigations after Indian independence estimated the real toll at 3 to 3.6 million. But even that doesn't capture the long-term death toll. Children who survived but suffered severe malnutrition had shortened lifespans, cognitive damage, compromised immune systems. They died decades younger than they should have. Their children were born smaller, weaker, with genetic damage from their parents' starvation. The famine's effects cascade through 3 generations. Communities were destroyed. Entire extended families were wiped out. Economic damage devastated the region for decades. Bengal, once a prosperous agricultural center, became one of India's poorest regions, and the environmental impact persists today. Desperate, starving people stripped forests for fuel and food. Topsoil erosion from abandoned farms still affects agricultural productivity. The region never fully recovered. Sunil Chatterjee, who lost his wife and 3 children, survived until 1978. He spent 35 years living with the memory of watching his family die while rice was exported past his village. He never received compensation, never received an apology, never saw anyone held accountable. He told his story to researchers in the 1970s, one of thousands of survivor testimonies that documented the truth. Then he died and his story was filed away, another voice in an archive nobody reads. The legal battle over the Bengal famine never happened. There was no trial, no investigation, no charges brought against anyone. The British administration classified the documents and moved on. After Indian independence in 1947, the new government had bigger problems than pursuing historical justice. The files stayed sealed. When they were finally declassified decades later, everyone responsible was dead. Churchill died in 1965, celebrated worldwide, given a state funeral, mourned as a hero. The other officials involved lived comfortable lives, received pensions, were never troubled by consequences. The grotesque math is simple. Killing 3.6 million people cost the British government nothing, not criminally, not financially, not politically in the long term. From a purely economic standpoint, the policy worked exactly as intended. The rice fed British soldiers and bolstered supplies across the empire. The war effort was supported. British citizens were kept comfortable, and 3.6 million Indians died out of sight, their deaths hidden in classified files, their stories erased from history books. That calculation, that determination that Indian lives were worth less than British convenience, that's still there in those government archives. You can read it yourself. The contempt is documented in official correspondence. Churchill's racist statements about Indians are a matter of public record, and yet he's still honored, still taught as a hero to schoolchildren. Because the people who write history books decided that 3.6 million dead Indians were less important than celebrating the man who saved Britain from the Nazis. The ongoing injustice is that this genocide, because that's what it was, is still barely taught. Most people in Britain don't know it happened. Most Americans have never heard of it. The few times it's mentioned, it's presented as a tragic consequence of World War II, as if war made the famine inevitable rather than acknowledging that policy decisions created it. The victims are still invisible, still uncounted, still considered less important than protecting Churchill's legacy. Right now, there are people alive in Bengal who lost grandparents in that famine, who grew up in poverty that traces directly back to 1943, who live in a region still recovering from decisions made 80 years ago, and they receive nothing. No reparations, no official recognition, not even an apology. But the Bengal famine isn't even the deadliest man-made disaster in history. That distinction goes to an event even fewer people know about. China, 1959 to 1961. The Great Leap Forward was supposed to be an economic transformation. Instead, it became the deadliest famine in human history. 15 to 55 million people died. The range is that wide because the Chinese government is still hiding the real numbers, still classifying documents, still prosecuting people who try to research it. What we know comes from leaked documents, survivor testimonies, and demographic analysis. Mao Zedong implemented policies that forced farmers to abandon traditional agriculture and work on massive industrial projects. Private farming was banned. Food was communally owned and distributed by the government. Farmers were ordered to plant seeds too deep, too close together, using techniques that guaranteed crop failure. When the crops failed, when people started starving, local officials reported that everything was fine because reporting problems meant being punished as a counter-revolutionary. So the government thought food production was increasing while millions starved. And when people tried to gather wild plants or catch fish to survive, they were arrested for stealing collective property and often executed. Parents were forced to watch their children starve to death because hiding food was a capital crime. Survivors report instances of cannibalism, of people so desperate they ate the dead. Reports of parents killing and eating their own children rather than watch them starve slowly. The Chinese government sealed these records, classified them, made researching the famine illegal. Scholars who try to investigate face arrest. The numbers are still uncertain because Beijing won't release the data. But even the conservative estimates put the death toll at 15 million, more people than live in entire countries, dead in 3 years. From policy decisions made by a government that refused to acknowledge its mistake even as the bodies piled up. 1984, Bhopal, India, December 2nd. A chemical plant owned by Union Carbide, an American corporation, was producing pesticides using some of the most toxic chemicals known to science, methyl isocyanate, a substance so deadly that exposure to even small amounts can kill. The plant had been cutting costs for years. Safety systems were shut down to save money. Warning sirens were disabled because they disturbed neighbors. Refrigeration units that were supposed to keep the chemicals cool were turned off. Maintenance was deferred. Workers who reported safety problems were fired. Union Carbide executives knew about every single one of these problems. They received reports. They chose profit over safety because fixing the problems would cost money, and the Indian government wasn't enforcing safety regulations. At 11 p.m. on December 2, 1984, water entered a storage tank containing 42 tons of methyl isocyanate. The chemical reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The temperature inside the tank spiked to over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure built rapidly. Safety valves that should have contained the reaction had been disabled to save money. At 12:40 a.m., the tank ruptured. A cloud of toxic gas exploded from the plant and drifted over Bhopal, a city of nearly 1 million people. The gas was heavier than air. It settled in the low-lying areas where the poorest people lived. People woke choking, their eyes burning, their lungs filling with fluid. They couldn't see, couldn't breathe, ran blindly through the streets trying to escape. Children died in their beds. Entire families were found dead in their homes hours later. The gas cloud covered an area of approximately 40 square kilometers. Over 500,000 people were exposed. Between 3,500 and 8,000 people died in the first 3 days. But that's just the immediate death toll. The real numbers are much worse. Complete. The people who survived that night didn't survive intact. The gas destroyed lung tissue, scarred eyes, damaged immune systems, caused neurological damage. Women who were pregnant gave birth to children with severe birth defects. Genetic damage was passed to the next generation. Over the next decades, the death toll climbed. 20,000 people have died from exposure-related illnesses so far. That number keeps growing. People are still dying today, 40 years later, from diseases caused by that night. The plant site was never properly cleaned. Union Carbide abandoned it. Toxic chemicals still contaminate the groundwater. Communities near the plant have cancer rates significantly higher than normal. Birth defect rates that are shocking. Children born decades after the disaster with damage caused by contaminated water their mothers drank while pregnant. The environmental devastation is permanent without massive cleanup that has never happened. Union Carbide fought accountability for decades. They argued the disaster was sabotage, claiming a worker deliberately caused it with no evidence. They settled for $470 million, for 500,000 injured people and 20,000 dead. That works out to about $500 per victim. The company calculated that paying victims was cheaper than admitting full responsibility and facing real consequences. And it worked. The CEO, Warren Anderson, was arrested when he visited India after the disaster. He was released on bail and fled the country. India requested extradition. The United States refused. Anderson lived comfortably in New York until he died in 2014 at age 92. Never spent a day in prison. Never faced trial. died peacefully in his home, while the people he was responsible for killing were still dying painful deaths in India. From a financial perspective, Union Carbide made the right decision. They limited their liability, protected their assets. The settlement was a rounding error compared to the company's value, and by fighting the case for decades, they ensured most victims died before receiving compensation. Those who did get money received amounts so small they couldn't even cover medical costs. The grotesque math worked. It cost less to let people die and fight the lawsuits than it would have cost to maintain proper safety systems. This wasn't incompetence. This was a calculated business decision, and it paid off. Union Carbide continued operating, was eventually bought by Dow Chemical. Dow refused to accept liability for Bhopal, claiming they only bought Union Carbide's assets, not its liabilities. They're still fighting compensation claims, still arguing they owe nothing to the victims. The Indian government has mostly given up trying to hold them accountable. The contaminated site still sits there, still poisoning groundwater, still killing people, because cleanup would cost more than the corporations are willing to pay, and the Indian government won't force them. So people keep dying. 40 years later, from a disaster that was entirely preventable, that happened because a corporation decided Indian lives were worth less than maintenance costs. This pattern repeats, constantly, globally. 1971, Iraq. The government distributed seed grain treated with mercury-based fungicide, supposed to be planted, not eaten. But the bags were labeled in English and Spanish, languages Iraqi farmers couldn't read. The grain looked normal. People were hungry. They made bread from it. Mercury poisoning killed approximately 6,000 people. The Iraqi government knew the grain was toxic, knew the labeling was inadequate, distributed it anyway, covered up the death toll. Most people have never heard of this disaster. 1978, Seveso, Italy. A chemical plant explosion released dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to science, over a populated area. The company, ICMESA, knew their safety systems were inadequate. The Italian government was aware of problems with the facility. Neither acted until after the explosion. 200 people developed chloracne, a severe skin disease. Thousands were exposed to dioxin. Animals died by the thousands. The area remained contaminated. Birth defects in the region increased dramatically. The company paid minimal compensation. Executives faced short prison sentences at most. The contaminated soil wasn't fully removed until decades later. The area is still monitored for contamination today. 1986, Basel, Switzerland. A Sandoz chemical warehouse caught fire. Firefighters used water to fight the blaze. The water mixed with chemicals and washed into the Rhine River. Approximately 30 tons of pesticides and other chemicals entered the river. The contamination killed 500,000 fish, destroyed eel populations that still haven't recovered, poisoned drinking water for 500,000 people. Sandoz paid minimal fines. No executives were imprisoned. The company continued operating and was later absorbed by Novartis. 2008, Kingston, Tennessee. A coal ash retention pond failed. 1.1 billion gallons of toxic sludge flooded 300 acres. The spill contained arsenic, mercury, lead, and other heavy metals. Cleanup took 6 years and cost over $1 billion, but the human cost was higher. Cleanup workers developed brain cancer, lung disease, and other illnesses at rates far higher than normal. Many have died. The Tennessee Valley Authority, responsible for the site, fought their claims for compensation. Most workers received nothing. The company faced minimal fines. Right now, as you watch this, there are over 1,400 coal ash ponds in the United States. Many are structurally unsound. Many are in densely populated areas. The Environmental Protection Agency knows which ones are at risk. That information is not publicly available. You don't know if you live near a retention pond that could fail and bury your home in toxic sludge. You don't know because the corporations that own these sites lobbied successfully to keep that information classified as confidential business information. This is the pattern. Corporations and governments know about dangers. They calculate that fixing problems costs more than compensating victims after disasters. They choose profit over safety because the legal system makes that the smart business decision. Then when disasters happen, they fight accountability, minimize death counts, hide evidence, settle for amounts less than prevention would have cost, and they win. The people responsible live comfortable lives. The corporations continue operating. The governments face no consequences, and it happens again. The reason these disasters repeat is simple. There's no real incentive not to repeat them. Safety costs money. Dead victims cost less. That's the equation. That's the math that determines whether you live or die. And that math won't change until the cost of killing people exceeds the cost of keeping them safe. Right now in dozens of countries there are facilities just like the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, chemical plants with inadequate safety systems, dams that are structurally unsound, industrial sites that will fail eventually. The companies operating them know about the problems, the governments know, and they're making the same calculation. Fixing it costs too much, victims cost less. You probably live near one of these sites, maybe work in one. The information about which facilities are dangerous exists. It's classified, protected as confidential business information. You're not allowed to know that you're at risk because telling you might hurt corporate profits. That's the system. That's what we learned from Bengal, from the Great Leap Forward, from Bhopal, from every disaster I've shown you. Human lives are worth less than profits. Some lives are worth less than others. And the people making these calculations face no consequences when people die. Now you know why these disasters aren't taught in schools. Why Churchill is still celebrated despite being responsible for 3.6 million deaths. Why corporations can kill tens of thousands and face fines that cost less than safety measures. Why governments classify information that could save lives. Because teaching you this truth would require admitting that the system is designed to protect profits, not people. That wealthy nations built their wealth on deliberately caused disasters in poor regions. That corporations exist to maximize shareholder value, not protect human life. That your government prioritizes business interest over your safety. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented facts. The files are declassified. The reports are public. The survivor testimonies are recorded. The evidence is overwhelming. It's just not widely taught because the truth is too damning. 3.6 million in Bengal, 15 to 55 million in China, 20,000 in Bhopal and counting, 6,000 in Iraq, thousands more in every smaller disaster, millions dead from decisions made in boardrooms and government offices. Millions more who will die in future disasters we could prevent but won't because prevention costs more than settlements. That's what you inherited. That's the system you live in. That's what business as usual really means. So what can you do? Start by verifying everything I've told you. The Bengal famine death toll, Churchill's documented statements, the Bhopal disaster timeline and Union Carbide's response, the Great Leap Forward estimates. All of this is documented in academic sources, declassified government documents, and investigative reports. Research it yourself, then share it. Because these stories survive only when people remember them. The governments and corporations that cause these disasters want them forgotten. Prove them wrong. Check if you live near industrial sites that pose risks. In the United States, the EPA maintains a risk management plan database. It's not comprehensive and it's not user-friendly, but you can search for facilities near you that store hazardous chemicals. Know what you're exposed to. Know what risks you face. Then demand accountability. Contact your representatives. Demand they close the loopholes that let corporations calculate that killing people costs less than keeping them safe. Demand criminal charges, not just fines, for executives whose decisions kill people. Demand declassification of information about dangerous sites in your area. Make enough noise that ignoring you becomes politically costly. Because right now, they can ignore you. They've ignored millions before you. Make ignoring you expensive. Let me ask you something. Did you know about even one of these disasters before watching this? Did you know about the Bengal Famine, the Great Leap Forward, Bhopal? If not, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what else you haven't been taught, what else has been hidden, what else is happening right now that you'll only learn about decades from now when it's too late to matter. Then leave a comment telling me whether you think this information should be taught in schools or if some truths are too dangerous for general knowledge. Currently, only about 17% of you are subscribed. If this video was worth your time, if this information matters to you, hit that subscribe button. Because the next video is about 3 government experiments that killed citizens without their knowledge or consent. Experiments that went on for decades. That your government still refuses to fully acknowledge. That your tax dollars funded. Trust me, you're going to want to see that one. History isn't what they taught you. It's what they hid from you. 3.6 million people died because one man decided they were worth less than military supplies. 55 million died because one government refused to admit its policies failed. 20,000 died and counting because one corporation decided safety cost too much. And every single one of these deaths was preventable, was deliberate, was calculated. Remember that. Because somewhere right now, someone is making the same calculation about you.